Mr. Tkacik 来给我们做专题演讲，好，这样。
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Is the microphone okay? Okay. Is this microphone better then, perhaps? Okay. Well, okay, good. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Michael. It's a real honor for me to be here. A little higher, a little louder. Honor for me to be here. I want to thank Dr. Luo Fuquan for inviting me. It's an honor to be here with Dr. Luo and Xu Shikai, two of the great diplomats in Taiwan history. Bill Stanton, of course, I've been a fan of yours for a long time, so it's great that you're here, and I'm really proud to be here. Who else do I have to give thanks to here? I will continue on. I want to first ask you all to please note page 255 of your conference book here. Peter Zhou has asked me to plug our book. We have this new book out, U.S. Strategic Pivot to Asia and Cross-Strait Relations, which can be ordered now directly from Palgrave Macmillan for the low price of $100 US. Now, my remarks in this morning's meeting are an extension of my contribution to Peter's book, which is the concluding chapter, chapter 12. But despite that, the book is still worth the price. Third, my thanks to Wang Lanhui, Kent Wang. Is he here? Oh, there we go. Kent, thank you very much. Kent did an excellent translation. I received several suggestions on my draft which led to late changes in the English text. So Kent's translation, if anybody's looking and say, well, this isn't what he's saying, it's because I changed the late draft. And so please bear that in mind when you're reading Kent. Kent did a great job. Well, this conference revolves around the pivot to Asia. I think we all know that the newspapers and the web pages, I mean, I read newspapers, but the youngsters read web pages these days. I mean, they're filled with news from Ukraine and Syria and Iraq, Boko Haram in Africa, Ebola. So one might feel that the US is pivoting to Asia at an inopportune moment in history. But unfortunately, moments in history are always inopportune. Soldiers and statesmen must not let their attention be distracted by moments in history, lest they lose sight of the tides of history. Now, you historians in the audience may have the same feeling that I do this morning. It's almost like October 1938 and the world is in crisis. Authoritarianism and totalitarianism menace Europe and Asia. The Middle East is in the grip of an evil and barbaric sectarian absolutism. The crisis in Ukraine these days seems a replica of Austria and Czechoslovakia in 1938. The Baltic nations today almost play the role of Poland in 1939. These are nations bound to the West by alliances, and when a crisis takes place, a war is likely to break out. And who knows when ISIS or ISIL in Mesopotamia will finally resolve itself. But I think this morning our attention is properly fixed on Asia, because that is where future history will be made. East Asia and the Western Pacific are now in a geopolitical power transition, with the United States as the dominant status quo power and China as the rising, challenging power. The United States has adopted a pivot posture to address this challenge. That pivot is, rather than increase our defense budgets and manpower, the US will pivot existing budgets and manpower away from Iraq and Afghanistan and toward the Pacific. Additionally, a new concept of air-sea battle will pivot the Pentagon's allocation of money and men away from the ground force heavy Middle East and to an air sea heavy and technology intensive maritime Pacific theater. In any case, Washington still faces severe financial limitations from a stagnant economy and a war-fatigued electorate that appears far more concerned about its economy than with global crises. Indeed, the capacity of the United States and Japan and Australia and the other Asian democracies to manage this power transition, and I'll explain power transition in a few minutes, will hinge on their combined military, economic, and industrial strength to balance China's rise. It is apparent to me that the key to the success or failure of this pivot or rebalance will be the ability of the United States and its allies and partners in the region, first, to agree upon a consistent and balancing strategy, and two, to coordinate its implementation among each other. In this, Taiwan's role will not be trivial. Whether Taiwan joins or is allowed to join the democracies, or whether it joins China, is a question that is likely to determine the outcome of the pivot and the outcome of Asia's future history. This morning, I will examine the hegemonic nature of China's quest for Asia and the rebalancing characteristics of the American pivot responses. These are two different things, a balancing and a hegemonic strategy. Taiwan's likely role as either a balancer with the Asian democracies or a bandwagoner with China's hegemonism will be the main focus of my discussion. Now let me talk about power transition theory in China. If you're looking for footnotes, the footnotes are in the original English. According to power transition theory, when a dissatisfied rising power achieves 80% of the comprehensive power of the dominant power, it begins to contemplate the use of force to satisfy its demands. Usually, not always, the challenger power seeks hegemony and preeminence in a new international system. It seems to me that in its quest for hegemony, the challenging power generally devises a strategy that encompasses economic, industrial, trade, finance, as well as social, including demographic, informational, media, cultural, propaganda, and migration building blocks that will undergird the strength of its hegemonic military power. The status quo power generally reacts. It doesn't have its own strategy. It sort of reacts to what's happening. And it reacts to the challenge by forming and consolidating its own alliances in an effort to build up and balance the rising power before the challenge erupts into armed conflict. Generally, that's unsuccessful. Generally, an armed conflict erupts, and we're all the worse off for it. America's Pacific hegemony in the last century, which climaxed in the so-called unipolar moment of the 1990s, was thrust upon it in the post-World War II era. But in the American strategy, if one could call it that, the American strategy was a balancing strategy of containment, as opposed to a conscious striving for global hegemony. Through the Cold War, America's was a balancing strategy that centered on parrying Soviet military hegemony in Eurasia and countering its ideological influence globally. The balancing game, however, as opposed to the hegemonic game, is at a fatal disadvantage against the hegemonic game whenever the balancing power is unaware or maybe can't believe that its adversary has hegemonic aspirations. China's modern leadership, I believe, understands this instinctively. In the rising power, America's leadership has never been comfortable with anything but a balancing strategy, and I think this is one of the reasons we're now facing a crisis in the international system. The rising challenging power, China, has now achieved a putative 80% threshold of combined economic and military power and continues to expand without any reliance on either military alliances or any commitment to the existing structure of international relations. In China, strategies for hegemony are almost as old as the culture itself. As far back as China's warring states era, the various Chinese kingdoms vied with each other in the ancient vertical and horizontal alliances. Status quo kingdoms balanced one another against more powerful rivals in the vertical alliances, while the rising kingdom of Qin consolidated its internal economic and military strength and then made use of cynical horizontal alignments with minor states in a single-minded, multi-decade power transition. And it was a quest for hegemony throughout China proper. In the end, the Qin destroyed even its minor allies and became the hegemon. Given that the kingdom of Qin sought hegemony instead of to balance the other powers, it is clear from the historical record that it had no intention ever of relying on alliances to prevail or of sharing power within the international system of the central states of China proper. Instead, the Qin focused on its internal strength in a strategy that was called enrich the state, strengthen the army. There was a certain sequential, staged aspect of this strategy of Fuguo Qianbing, in the sense that in the northwestern frontier kingdom of Qin, the kingdom must first enrich the state from the poverty-stricken condition it was in before it could actually strengthen the army. Likewise, for the past decade or so, more than the past decade, the People's Republic of China has revived the enrich the state, strengthen the army as the organizing principle of its own expansion. I think many foreign policy analysts in the United States and in Europe have convinced themselves that China does not seek hegemonic status, but rather a mere non-military great power status that might enhance its influence in global affairs. I think some policymakers might see evidence of a hegemonic strategy, but then they simply can't believe their eyes. They just don't believe what they see is actually taking place. And then there are other Western analysts, I think, who do worry that China is in fact seeking hegemony. Chinese military theorists, on the other hand, have outlined comprehensive hegemonic strategies since 1999. China's international relations scholars, however, writing for foreign publication, generally argue that China's goals are limited. Now, I, of course, will argue that China does have a strategy. And to paragraph that great American philosopher T. Boone Pickens, a fool with a strategy can beat a genius with no strategy any day. And a player that has a strategy, as Sun Tzu, I think, pointed out, is well advised not to let his adversary know what it is, lest the adversary work to stymie it. In modern times, power transition dynamics historically have almost always resulted in major warfare. So hold on to your seats. Heretofore, the European nation-state system, the dominant balancing powers, together with their allies, have generally prevailed over the rising hegemonic power. However, they've prevailed at great economic and social costs. In the last century, we had the example of 2 world wars and a Cold War. In the 21st century, China is the rising power and the United States is the status quo power. The Chinese leadership hopes to consolidate both its domestic and international legitimacy for the Chinese communist regime by supplanting the United States as the dominant power in the Asia-Pacific region, if not globally. And China's leaders believe that this hegemony will demonstrate the superiority of socialism with Chinese characteristics. I think we're all aware that China last year went through a 12-hour television documentary on how empires rise and fall, with the idea that the Chinese Communist Party is not going to make mistakes of the previous rising powers. I think this morning I have to suggest that China's leadership has adopted Sun Tzu Bingfa and as its primary blueprint. The uppermost stratagem in warfare is to stymie the enemy's plans. The next is to stymie his alliances. And I think you all know that as Gu Shang Bing Fa Mo, Qi Zi Fa Jiao. The traditional rendering of this passage is that the first is better than the second. Fa Mo is better than to Fa Jiao. But I actually don't see it that way. I see it as sequential, again, as a stage thing. It seems to me that Sun Tzu may also have meant that once an enemy's plans are stymied, then you can go and undermine his alliances. China, however, will have no trouble stymieing America's plans because, frankly, America doesn't have any plans. But America does have alliances, and America does have security partnerships in East Asia, and China's obvious strategy now is how to undermine America's alliances across Asia, with Taiwan as being one of America's key security partners, whether or not Washington policymakers understand this or not. It has also always been a central focus of China's strategic policy to loosen America's security relationship with Taiwan. And I have to say that their diplomats apparently are better than ours. No offense to anybody present, myself included. Let me talk about China at the 80% threshold. I really don't believe that there can be any serious disagreement now that China has already achieved the 80% threshold vis-a-vis the United States. First, China is today the world's largest industrial power. It's the world's largest consumer of resources. In some cases, such as steel output, China controls the majority of global steel output. Two, it's the world's leading trading nation. In purchasing power parity terms, China's GDP will surpass the United States this year. In purchasing power parity terms, China's annual military spending has been of the same order of magnitude as America's for several years. And indeed, if China's expenditures on internal security forces under the command of the Central Military Commission are included, China's military expenditures could actually be greater than the United States. And then I'm a member of the class of 1989 at the National War College, and we had a luncheon last weekend, and one of my classmates also mentioned that about a quarter of all U.S. defense spending is on health care. So I'm thinking, well, if you subtract the health care that the Defense Department spends on each year, and subtract the health care that the People's Liberation Army spends each year, you actually might get a Chinese military budget that's about the same, if not greater than America's. But I digress, I'm sorry. In the naval arena, China's Navy is building up a fleet that already outnumbers the US Navy assets deployed in the Western Pacific. Chinese advances in space and cyber warfare, I think, place it on a par with the United States. Its land army is the largest in the world. It's also very well equipped. And one of the things that has upset me for a number of years is that China's nuclear arsenal is becoming more modern than that of the United States, and it continues to grow and modernize while the US nuclear arsenal has shrunk, and I think the modernization has been compromised. I think one of the pieces of evidence that America's nuclear weapons modernization is compromised is that purely by accident they sent 2 or 3 nuclear weapons triggers to Taiwan, and I think they just sat here I hope they just sat here for 2 years before somebody figured out what was happening and sent them back. You know, but that's the kind of, dangerous evidence that something deeply is wrong. Admiral Locklear, the US Pacific commander, I think noted in January, quote, "Our historic dominance that most of us in this room have enjoyed is diminishing, no question." When an admiral says that publicly, I tend to get very nervous. Now, of course, the Chinese, as the Chinese might say, 综合国力, comprehensive power. Comprehensive power is as comprehensive power does. Japan and the European Union have comprehensive power, considerable comprehensive power. The United States does. If you consider global output and the trade and their demographic size, their global investments, diplomatic influence, military capabilities. Yet, you know, they don't exercise that comprehensive power in nationalistic aggrandizement. And until this century, Taiwan had been the only major target of China's irredentism. But of course, there were sporadic military clashes between China and Vietnam, and occasional forays into India and areas of the South China Sea claimed by the Philippines. But since the beginning of this century, China has leveraged its comprehensive power in an increasingly, unsettlingly aggressive way against all of its neighbors, well, a good number of its neighbors. From India through Burma, through Southeast Asia, through the South China Sea, Taiwan, and Japan, of course, and even to a certain extent, the South Koreans get a bit edgy. The clear purpose of this is intimidating its peripheral neighbors into territorial concessions and acquiring regional hegemony. So there it is. That's China's goal. That goal will help consolidate the strength of the Chinese Communist Party. Generally, the United States has been dismissive of expansion of Chinese military power during a time when the US itself was occupied with Iraq, Afghanistan, and to a lesser extent in containing North Korean and Iranian nuclear weapons development. But in all these exigencies, Washington labored under, in hindsight, the misapprehension that Beijing appeared willing to cooperate in managing these crises if only the United States would cooperate with China on the Taiwan issue. Washington adopted a stance of constructive engagement, or later they called it candid, constructive, and cooperative relations with Beijing, apparently believing that making concessions on Taiwan policy would incline Beijing towards substantive assistance with the global war on terror and nuclear proliferation and who knows what else. In the first decade of the 21st century, policymakers in Washington have also persuaded themselves that constructive engagement would yield Chinese cooperation in such non-security challenges as climate change and other environmental crises, transnational organized crime, the global financial crisis. But again, in hindsight, it is clear that Beijing's strategic goals in all of these areas were diametrically opposite of Washington's. I think Beijing's I think the Pentagon's assessments of China's aims were never really as rose-colored as those of diplomats or the White House aides. For example, I think as early as 2008, Admiral Timothy Keating, then the US commander in the Pacific, recounted for a Washington think tank audience, which I was in, the conversation that he had with a Chinese admiral. He said the Chinese admiral made the following proposition: we, China, when we build our aircraft carriers, you Americans take from Hawaii east, and China will take our aircraft carriers, with our aircraft carriers, we'll take Hawaii west. And you stay over there, and we'll stay over here, and we'll share information with you back and forth, but we'll save you the trouble from coming to the Western Pacific. I think at the end of 2009, it seemed to me, the scales began to fall from US diplomats' eyes, and the real tensions with China in global affairs came into sharp focus. There were a series of US Navy confrontations with the Chinese Navy through 2009, and this is the period that Bill Stanton was mentioning during his presentation. In November of 2009, President Obama even traveled to Beijing and gave Beijing a joint statement which he made with President Hu Jintao, which gave Hu Jintao everything he wanted, even on Taiwan. I think Ray Burkhardt had to come here the following week and try to explain that it was only words and that he didn't mean it. There was no change in US policy. But I think on the political side, in one particularly galling incident in December of 2009 that Bill didn't mention, was the Chinese delegation humiliated President Obama personally at the climate change conference in Denmark. And this behavior, I think, sparked a radical change and a radical reassessment by President Obama himself on what was happening in the US-China strategic dynamic. I saw myself a marked change in US policy toward China throughout 2010, and I think that the Obama White House was getting very suspicious of China, something that was reflected in the press statements of Secretary Clinton and Secretary Gates during that entire time. I will say that they hadn't quite focused on Taiwan at that point yet. In fact, throughout 2011, they still hadn't focused on Taiwan, but I think that's changing. At any rate, let me talk a little bit about air-sea battle and the pivot to Asia. I'm not sure if that's, now should I? Okay. Oh, too long. I'm sorry, I thought I was given 40 minutes, but
try your best.
No, I will talk about air-sea battle and the pivot to Asia some other time. And besides, as my professors used to tell me in class, it's all in the book. Read the book. So let me just go through this, and anybody that's with the media here, if you want to say I said what's in the paper that's in the book, then you can go ahead and say that. That's all for the record. I will say that my focus is on a lot of the law of the sea issues in the South China Sea, and I do agree with Ambassador Dr. Stanton that this offers a very interesting avenue of approach for Taiwan. I want to remind people that President Ma Ying-jeou is perhaps the world's expert on seabed demarcations, having written his dissertation on it, which still is quite a very good piece of work. It doesn't really take into account, his dissertation I think was written in 1982, just as the UN Commission Conference on Law of the Sea is being written. And there have been a lot of actual adjudication, litigation, procedural changes that have taken place in international law since his dissertation. But if he wants to go that route, he knows what he's doing. I have a sense that perhaps maybe he would not want to go that route because this will cause some of the frictions with China that Dr. Stanton mentioned earlier. However, somebody after Ma Ying-jeou, who perhaps maybe does not have the same commitment to the Republic of China's territorial claims in the ocean, might actually look at this as a constructive way to engage Taiwan's partners in East Asia. But that's something that we can look at later. I'm going through, I've got 35, 40 pages here. I say it's all in the book. I will say the current trends, however, suggest that future historians of America's Pacific pivot, when the history of America's foreign policy in Asia is written in the year 2050, they will all say that pivot really didn't amount to much, did it? It was doomed to the start because unlike the American island chain strategy of the last century, there was no place in the pivot for Taiwan. I think future historians will judge China's 21st century Pacific presence as a major maritime power, a Haiyang Daguo, which is what China is, front pages of the People's Daily now proclaims China as. Future historians will judge China's 21st century Pacific presence to have been assured by Beijing's well-planned, deft, and relentless diplomatic isolation of Taiwan and the steady alienation of Taiwan from America's security network and Japan's and Australia's and the rest of democratic Asia over the preceding half century. So Taiwan's role in the transition, in a power transition that is taking place now, for better or for worse, will be literally, well, will be pivotal. But as I say, it's all in the book, so, and it'll be on the test. There'll be a test next Friday at the, okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, thank you.
他整个论文里边呢，我想他刚刚